Kayvan.
All right. Thank you, everybody. This is really cool. Really good turnout. Thanks to Creative Mornings folks and Denver Public Library for hosting us. So, I thought we'd talk a little bit about Denver's housing and homelessness problem. It's not just a Denver issue, obviously. It's something that the entire country is dealing with. But there are things that are unique to Colorado, not just in our problems, but some of the things that folks are doing on the ground to try to resolve this. So I think it's important to remember when we're talking about this that there's no panacea for homelessness and our housing crisis. It really is going to take a myriad of options, dozens and dozens of things working in synergy together to resolve this. And why I picked this on the topic of commitment is because it really takes a commitment on all of us as well. We don't have to be an elected official or be an organization that works on this. My businesses are all very active on this topic in a way that suits that business and the people that follow it and patronize it. But it's really incumbent on all of us to participate in this in some fashion. I've been homeless myself. 10 years ago, I spent 9 months homeless here in Denver when I started my entrepreneurial career. And now to this day, having these 13 businesses in 8 different states and 4 industries, it shows what's possible. I think if people have a network of support around them, and I think that's very critical. It goes beyond housing. Housing is a thing, but there's services that need to accompany that, especially around mental health and substance abuse, workforce development. And I think it's important to remember that when we're talking about housing and homelessness, that homelessness is not necessarily a housing issue. That's a component of that, but how we criminalize homelessness in the city, in the state of Colorado and across the country is a civil rights issue, right? We are taking our most marginalized people that are at the end of their rope, that feel helpless, and criminalizing their existence. And that continues to make matters worse here and across the country. Curious how many people in this room know somebody here in Denver that's struggling with rent or to find affordable, attainable housing? Surprised there's not more. Wanted to go over the scope of the problem. So right now there's about 60,000 houses short in the Denver metro area at AMI of 30% or below. We're going to talk about AMI a little bit more later, but it's area median income. So this is based on income levels that people have, housing that they can't afford to fit 30% or less of their salary being paid out to rent or housing costs. There's 87,000 when you go up to that 50% AMI number. About 1/3 of the population of Denver currently rents. 50% of those people are considered rent burdened, which means that they spend more than a third of their income on housing, more than 30% of their income on housing. And 25% are severely rent burdened, which means that they pay more than 50% of their income on their housing costs, which is not sustainable no matter where you're at. They call those 25% on the verge of homelessness pending a moment of a health moment, losing a job, losing a spouse, having some other issue that creates some turmoil in their life. We currently have 7,000 people living on the streets of Denver, more than that on any given night. Keep in mind that's point in time, so really throughout a year we'll have as many as 20 to 30,000 people experience homelessness in Denver. 2,500 Denver public school students at any given time or throughout a year are homeless. I think that's a part of the population that we don't talk about, right? We have teachers that aren't funded properly. We have schools that don't have the supplies that they need. We also have thousands of kids going to school that are homeless every single day and dealing with the troubles of that. And last year in Denver, we had 232 people die on our streets last night. Some froze to death, drug abuse, a myriad of different reasons for that, but people that did die on our streets. And I think it's important to remember this issue is getting worse, and I'm going to go over some of the reasons for that. It starts with what happened back in the 80s, but this isn't freezing, right? We're not doing enough even right now. These wins, quote unquote, that our city likes to espouse and say that that this is really digging into the problem. It's not. We're not doing nearly enough to even curb this, let alone resolve it. And we can expect this to get much worse, especially as we head into a recession here in the next 2 to 3 years, which we're expected to. Keep in mind this problem's gotten much worse in the biggest boom that this state and this city has ever seen. Right now, I think there's an 8 million unit deficit on the national level for attainable housing. And a lot of that started back in the 80s. Ronald Reagan, as a response to the recession, cut out pretty much all the funding from HUD for housing, but also mental health services. You can see this stops at about 2006. So now that was at about $30 million. Now it's at about $40 million. But compare that to what we provide as a federal government in tax incentives to middle income and wealthy individuals on their housing and mortgage interest. That's $195 billion. So we're spending 5 times the amount of money providing essentially subsidies to the wealthy in this country instead of focusing that money, those resources, on affordable and attainable housing. And on that AMI note, I think it's important to clarify the difference between affordable and attainable. Affordable is something that is based on the AMI spectrum. When we talk about building affordable units in Denver, we're generally talking about 60 to 80% AMI housing, which does not fit into most people's lives. We have a huge deficit of 0 to 60% AMI, 0 to 30% AMI. That's what we like to call attainable, something that's actually within reach of folks. The other aspect that really created, so this was back in the 80s, but a decade before that, Richard Nixon declared the war on drugs. And to me, this is the precursor to all of that, and one of the other big things federally that we really need to fix. As you can see, most folks are arrested and imprisoned, incarcerated for drug offenses. Most of these are nonviolent. We're not viewing this and homelessness and sex work, things that are public health issues, as public health issues. We're treating them as criminal. We put people in jail for these things that they're generally doing to survive, to get through their life, to deal with life. And we're putting these burdens on them once they get out that creates barriers to housing and employment, child custody, financial aid, and of course without the mental health services, the substance abuse services that we've almost entirely defunded, not at just the federal level, but the state and local levels, it's almost next to impossible for these people to get back on their feet. This kind of shows that, back when the housing funding stopped, we had about 41,000 people incarcerated on drug offenses, and today it's well over 500,000 people. Our prison population in general is almost 5x what it was back then, and most of these people are there for non-violent offenses, people that were probably doing something that was a response to an issue in life, a deficiency in life, a deficiency in our system that we didn't adequately address. Keep in mind that these numbers are point in time. So there's 2.3 million incarcerated Americans at any given time, but there are now more than 9 million people who are living in this country that have had past prison experience, and those burdens continue to haunt them throughout their lives. Once your term is done, it's not like you have all the ability in the world to get these jobs and to get this housing, especially in a competitive market like Denver. Makes it very much more difficult to get it, and this carries through people until they pass, unfortunately. We've multiplied by 12 the number of people in jail or prisons since the war on drugs started. And it's also not just a federal problem, it's a state and local problem. So if you look at, there's actually very few people in federal prisons on this. Most people are held at the state and local level. So this is something that we're controlling, that we're choosing not to take ownership of and to remedy. When you look at the fact that subsidizing somebody's housing is 1/3 the cost of throwing them in jail, that should be easy enough for us to understand that maybe there's a better solution there. Spending these kinds of resources on incarcerating people, especially for nonviolent public health concerns, is exactly why we have issues with funding our schools, with funding public transportation, with funding all the other public health and safety and security things that we preach is deficient in our state legislature, but yet we want to do nothing about this. And the saddest part of this is most of these jails and prisons have turned private. So they're now profit centers, similar to what we're removing in schools with charter schools. We're starting to find profit in these broken systems, and that makes it very much more difficult to turn over. Here in Colorado, we have a unique thing called TABOR. Most of you are aware of it, Taxpayer Bill of Rights. A lot of people blame this on a lot of our issues. I don't buy it. I think it's certainly an issue. It's a part of the problem that we're dealing with, but when I look at those numbers of the number of people that are in jail, I know how much money is sitting on the table that we're choosing to spend ineffectively and not wisely. And here in Denver, we've done the same. Here in Denver, last year, for instance, we spent more on deputy overtime in our county jails than we did on affordable housing. We spent more money settling cases of police and sheriff's department power abuse than we did on affordable housing, settling those cases, the civil cases brought. We spent more on an LED sign at the airport than we did on affordable housing last year. So if that goes to show you the priorities of where the city's at, should be pretty good. And then also, I don't know if you saw the Paris trips recently. After a deal was already struck and signed on the dotted line, our city spent $13,000 per 30 people, $400,000 to send 30 people to Paris for no good reason whatsoever. I think there's about $780,000 that we've spent on first-class flights in this current administration over the last 3 years. Another issue, and I don't necessarily view this as a resolution, but it's certainly a tool in the toolbox that we're not using, which is rent control. There are very few states that actually allow for rent control. Most of the states that have gotten out of hand, California and New York, do so. Most states actually prohibit it. This doesn't need to be that heavy-handed, but what it could do in places like Denver when we go through these growth spurts is mitigate landlord opportunism by having only a certain percentage that rents can increase each year to make sure that somebody that's already rent burdened doesn't see a 2x increase in their rents, which so many people have in Denver here recently. Especially when you look at the housing downtown that's being built, that's becoming so expensive. We're becoming more of a service industry city. We have all these people that are making minimum wage or a little more than that now have to live further and further outside of town. We do not have the public infrastructure in the city to keep pushing those people out, and that's why our roads are clogged. People are spending more on cars and car maintenance and traveling because we don't have the public transportation infrastructure. One of the things that I think we should and could do most easily, and keep in mind on rent control, precluded as a city to engage in rent control. State law precludes it. Same thing with minimum wage. Denver cannot just raise the minimum wage if we choose to. Right now, the minimum wage is $10.20 to afford an average one bedroom in Denver, which is about $1,300. To be able to afford that per hour, you should be making $26 an hour. To not spend more than 30% of your income on housing. So to say that we should be paying the same minimum wage here in Denver that somebody is in a rural part of the state is asinine to me. There's places like Seattle that have done scaled minimum wages. So if you're a larger company like an Amazon, I hope they don't come here, they won't, they're too smart. Seattle, if you're a bigger company, you're multinational, you have more employees, you can afford and should be paying a higher minimum wage than a small business. As somebody that owns a lot of small businesses, at my pizzeria even, everybody walks home with 15 to 22 bucks an hour after tips. We have full-time employees that have access to 75% paid health care, dental, we have a company match on a retirement plan, we have PTO, we have paid leave, and guess what, we still make a profit. So for these people that tell me that you can't take care of your employees and not make a profit, I don't buy it. Criminalization of homelessness is a big issue. We've been trying to pass the Right to Rest Act every year in Colorado, and the legislature. It has not happened 4 years in a row. We've had people like Paul Rosenthal. I'm glad he's not running again. He's an awful person. Vote no on this 4 years in a row and then cry after it, saying how unfortunate it is that these people are living on the streets and dealing with this. As somebody who's slept on the streets, done it the last couple of years just to see what these experiences are like, 6 hours, I get swept 4 times. In that period, and to think about the burden that puts on people mentally and emotionally to get back up and go to work the next day. And most people don't know that over half the people that live on the streets of Denver have jobs. They simply can't afford the rent that we have here. We have about 150 some criminalization laws on homelessness in Colorado on the books right now that we've tried to overturn, didn't happen. So next year, Denver Homeless Out Loud, myself, a couple other groups are running a ballot initiative to repeal the urban camping ban here in Denver. So I hope you all know that that's coming in 2019, and that'll be one of the many cool ballot initiatives that we have coming up. So some of the local hurdles that we're dealing with, those are primarily at the state level, but some of the local hurdles that we're dealing with is general defunding. 10 years ago, we spent $16 million more dollars on affordable housing than we did last year, and we were in a crisis last year. We weren't 10 years ago. I have personally identified what I believe is $85 million in our general budget that we could and should be spending on affordable housing without raising a single penny of taxes. And I also believe that there are foundations here in Denver that we've talked to that are just so dissatisfied with the way the city's running that if there is a succinct and clear plan that we could get behind and take big chunks out of this, that they would match that $85 million a year, and that we would have $170 million a year to tackle our housing and homelessness crisis, as opposed to the paltry $9 million that we spent last year. What we lack is the will and leadership to get this done, not just in our mayor's office, but at every position in city council. I'm dissatisfied with every single one of them, even the people that I like, because they're not standing up for what's right. So as a part of what we're doing next year, there's going to be 13 council candidates that are going to be challenging all 13 seats, and I hope that people participate in a 2019 election. And I say that because the last presidential election we had 86% turnout here in Denver, which is the highest in the country of registered voters. Last municipal election, where our problems can really be fixed, where we can actually control them, we had 30% turnout. This is one of the biggest issues that we have in this city, TIF, tax increment financing. So what this does is it gives developers a break on property taxes for 30 or 40 years down the road. And in exchange for that, they're supposed to build projects that are for the community benefit. And that could be affordable housing, it could be a park, they could be building infrastructure like streets and putting in fire hydrants and sidewalks and all these things that we should get out of giving them a break on their property taxes. Instead, they're building luxury high-rises. So we're about 30,000 like of the most marginalized, that 0 to 10% AMI housing unit short in Denver. We have about 30,000 empty luxury units sitting in Denver right now. Empty because the market just doesn't need them. And we've created that by subsidizing and incentivizing developers to do that. So what are we doing now? We're then spending more money subsidizing these luxury units so that they can become quote unquote affordable. So we're bailing these developers out for making very bad market decisions. Also tied into that are linkage fees. Linkage fees are a fee per square foot of new construction. So a good example of this is the new 1144 15th building. They call it the new icon of Denver, the new high-rise downtown. It's 662,000 square feet, 40 stories high. So they paid $1.55 per square foot of that, which equates to a little over $1 million, which would pay for about 4 affordable housing units, right? We have a $1.50 linkage fee here. In Boulder, it's $30. And I know developers in Boulder that tell me that they're still making money hand over fist in Boulder paying that $30. And the fact that we've kept it at $1.50 here is deplorable. So back to AMI, I guess that was one. I'm going to go back to that one. So this is the AMI scale. So for one person, this 80% AMI housing that we talk about, affordable housing that contractors are building, that the city's funding, that we're claiming are huge wins, those are for people making $50,000 a year. I know a ton of families of 4, families of 3 that are living on $40,000 or less. They do not have housing available to them. So we're incentivizing really the middle income folks. I'm not saying they don't need housing too, but I think we should probably focus on folks that are having a little tougher time of it, and it's next to impossible for them to find housing. Again, I go back, so minimum wage, $10.20, that's $21,216 a year for one person. So minimum wage puts you in between this 30 and 50% mark, and there's almost zero housing here for them. Things we can do in the city. Actually, let me go back real quick to this one. Skilled labor shortages is also another one. By 2025, we're supposed to have 96,000 vacancies in our construction trades of skilled labor that we need. And that's one of the reasons that construction is so expensive, because the people out there do not exist to build these buildings. Why are we throwing people in jail for criminal health or public health concerns when we could be providing them very inexpensive trade skills and training to get them back on their feet and to get the good paying jobs that exist in the construction industry? So city solutions, I think that until further notice that all affordable housing money, all these funds should go to 0 to 60% AMI. It's simply not being spent, period. And when you're in a crisis, you have to do things that move the needle, that get us beyond status quo. We are there as a city right now. Another thing we can do are instill renters' rights. And we just had some great movement at the state level where they extended the time of eviction from, I think it was 3 in some places, 10 in some places, up to 21 days, which still isn't a lot after you get an eviction notice before you have to get the heck out. They also now require landlords to give copies of receipts and leases, something that wasn't legally required, so there was very little recourse for folks that are bad filers or didn't get it, that are just less savvy when it comes to what documentation they should be keeping to protect themselves. Month-to-month leases are a problem in Denver. There's a lot of opportunistic landlords that are saying, I put on a new front door lock on the house, therefore, due to the lease, that's a capital expense, and I'm going to raise your rent $300 next month. That stuff happens all the time, predatory landlordism to push people out and make sure that folks can get more when nothing else happened to this house. These landlords are doing it purely for profit, for no other reason. Go back to linkage fees. I mean, I'm not saying we need to go 30, but goodness, when we're 20x in Boulder, what we're dealing with here in Denver, there's a lot of room to make developers pick up some of this burden. They are profiting dramatically from the growth of the city. Most of them are international and national companies that have no stake in Denver, in the future of Denver, and they're raping and pillaging it, plain and simple. And until we start putting the onus on them to start remedying this, we're not going to get any better. Sales tax, this is a state and voter solution. Obviously, because of Tabor, we have to vote on all increases. Los Angeles just last year, 2 years ago, voted on a 25-cent sales tax increase that now raises over $1 billion for homelessness every year. We are going to have a ballot initiative this fall, I believe, run by the Chamber of Commerce that's going to increase sales tax so we can widen our roads. So keep your eye on that and don't vote for it. Property tax increases, everybody knows about our values increasing dramatically here in Denver. The reason those valuations go up in our property tax is so that we can borrow more as a city. The fact that property valuations are up 2x, 3x in some parts of the city, that means our city is now worth 2 to 3 more x when it comes to how much debt we can take on. So when you look at the GO bond that we all passed last fall, which a third of that was for deferred maintenance, that if we were good at managing our city, we would have been maintaining along the way. None of it went to affordable housing. None of it went to the needs and the crisis that we're dealing with. We're going to end up paying $1.7 billion back on that $937 million that we borrowed. I'm going to talk about a way we can get around that coming up here too, but a lot of people want to take the extra mill levy. We have like half mill levy extra on our property taxes that we can use to borrow $200 million right now today if we vote on that as a city to put towards affordable housing and homelessness. It's something a group called All in Denver is running. I'd encourage you to get in touch with them. They have wonderful studies and surveys that they've done that showed this as by far the #1 concern that people in Denver have and want to see addressed and don't feel that the city's addressing. I think it's over 90% of people in Denver don't feel that the city's doing enough on this topic. I think it was LA as well. They did a parcel tax or something similar. That they raised $1.2 billion for housing last year in a voter initiative. The way we can get out of paying these egregious interest rates is with public banks. I think public banks are the future. North Dakota has them. Most other countries have them. It is really the future of how we keep money in these communities. It's very simple. Citizens pay taxes, they go to state government, they invest in Wall Street, they gamble through derivatives and speculation, and then those profits go back to Wall Street and they never make it back to the people. And public banking keeps all that money here. So right now in the city coffers we have about $6 billion in readily liquidable assets that we could and should be spending on Denver in this crisis right now. Almost $1 billion of that is held in derivative investments. We lost our ass on that as a city in the last recession, and we went right back and invested in those things. If we were smarter, we would have set up a city public bank, regardless of what the state wants to do, taken that $1 billion and used that to fund what we voted for in our GO bond last year. We'd be paying nominal interest. We're talking 3, 4, 5%, as opposed to this almost 100% that we're spending borrowing the way that we did for that GO bond last year. The best thing about public banks as well, in my opinion, is that in a recession, Wells Fargo, U.S. Bank, Chase, all these, they pull back an investment. They don't give mortgages, interest rates go up, they don't lend to small businesses. That deepens recession. Public banks continue to lend at the same frequency that they would if our market's doing well. This is do I have their name? I don't have it on here. There is a Rocky Mountain Public Banking Institute. Is a group here in Colorado, if you want to look them up, that's very, very much working on this topic here in Colorado. DARCO, Denver Artists for Rent Control, is a group that's advocating for rent control legislation at the state level. If that's a thing that you're interested in helping them out with, I encourage you to reach out to them. They're working with this group also, 9 to 5 Colorado, which came about the last couple of years. It's advocating for working families and workers' rights. So they're advocating for higher minimum wage, they're advocating for rent control, they're advocating for a lot of the things that people feel would cure the inequities, or at least help curb them a little bit that we're dealing with. Another one is community land trusts. How many people in here are familiar with community land trusts? A few people. So pretty much what it does is it allows for community to own the land that housing sits on. And you build the housing, and then the housing it's kind of deed restricted in the sense that it can only appreciate so many percent each year. So that when people sell that house that owned it, that bought it, they're ground leasing from the community, that they can still take the equity that they built up that's nominal, that goes along with inflation. They can take that out when they sell that house, but when they sell that house, it's going to be at that deed restricted pricing that maintains its affordability regardless of these wild swings that we're dealing with in the market. GES, Globeville, Elyria, Swansea, Community Land Trust is another group that's doing great work up in North Denver. I think they have 3 or 4 properties that they own right now, and they're identifying 5 to 10 more that they'd like to purchase here over the next couple of years. Keeps ownership in community. Tiny homes. This is our first beloved community village that the city made us move 6 months. We did this with a group called ASAP, Alternative Solutions Advocacy Project, that I was brought in to bring businesses to the table, because whenever our mayor or our governor says businesses don't want to see homeless people, it's bad for business, tourists don't want to see it. When they say businesses, they mean the Chamber of Commerce and the Downtown Denver Partnership. Those are 2 of the most evil organizations in the city, if you ask me. So what we've done is we put together a socially conscious Chamber of Commerce of sorts. It used to be an informal thing, and it still is in a lot of regards, but we have another group that has a founding member of Good Business Colorado that I'd recommend you look up. They're small business owners that are advocating for employee rights. They're advocating for all the things that we talked about today, paid leave, time off for voting, things of that nature. There is a movement on that front happening right now. But we also have an informal one. I passed a cannabis social use initiative in 2016 with the city destroyed in rulemaking, as they're trying to do with our green roof initiative that we passed last year as well. But the city did not want to do this. We have a 6-month permit allowance for this location, so for no reason other than the city wanted us to, we had to spend $20,000 to move this across an alley 6 months after construction. We finally got them to extend 6-month periods so we can have to get that permanently codified in our zoning code so that these can be permanent installations. They're on urban land conservancy land, which is essentially a land bank that's there for future affordable housing development or other community needs. A lot of these lots are sitting empty across the city that won't be built for 5 to 10 years. Why can't we, in a crisis, use them as transitional housing? We have one going up, breaking ground next month on St. Andrew's Church. Church properties are a wonderful example of people who should be practicing what they preach, right? 5,000 empty acres that they could and should be using to help with this crisis. And we're starting to see faith-based organizations come on board with that. So our second one breaks ground at St. Andrew's Church downtown. It's going to house trans and cis women who have dealt with violence on the streets and shelter system. And our one this fall is going to focus on refugees. And at the end of the year, if we stand all 3 of these up, we're going to end up housing about 50 people in these tiny homes for the cost of 2 status quo affordable housing units. tiny housing. We have a goal at ASAP to try to build 1,000 of these over the next 5 years. And we're going to push the city to do it whether they like it or not. We privately fund it at this point, and we're going to continue to do that. If you do want to get involved in that, we need folks to build it. We need folks to source materials. We need folks to donate to it, time or money, or both. You can go to belovedcommunityvillage.com or movealongtowhere.com, which is our alternative solutions advocacy project website. Accessory dwelling units are a great way to create horizontal density. Right now in this city, only 20% of our residential properties allow for accessory dwelling units, which are essentially tiny homes in people's backyards. Now these cost anywhere from $10,000 to $50,000 to build. The average affordable housing unit in a high-rise that we're building today, status quo, costs $250,000 to $300,000 to build. So to think of how we could use city money much more effectively to not only build these units that create this horizontal density, that remove the concentration of this issue of homelessness that we're dealing with, but that also empower people on fixed incomes. Most of the people in North Denver that have owned for a long time own their homes free and outright. People say, how could they be getting pushed out of their homes? It's because property taxes have gone up 2 to 3x over the last 10 years. When you're on a fixed income, that's a big chunk of money. You can't keep up with the maintenance on your homes. You can't do all these things that I think a lot of us take for granted in making sure that we can stay in a home that we own outright. Having $300 to $600 a month income come in from one of these deed-restricted properties that the city would pay for and empower residents to stay in their homes is something we should look at, and our city still, unfortunately, is very much against. Portland has a program like this. It's not managed very well, but I think it's something we can modify and bring to Denver pretty easily. Co-living, this is a Queen City Cooperative. I don't know how many people are familiar with them, but what they do is essentially buy properties that unrelated people live in, and they're living, unfortunately, illegally right now because you can't have 3 unrelated people living in a home in Denver. It's illegal. How many people are living illegally in the city right now? These are all these little things that we can fix to curb this housing crisis that don't cost us any money, right? There's a lot that we can do in our occupancy code to make sure that places like this that that are meeting people where they live, right? That are modifying and evolving as the city grows to fit how people live. So what they're going to do now is take the equity that they have in this home and they're going to buy additional properties across Denver and continue doing that. And it's a shared ownership amongst many people. Again, giving ownership back to people, giving agency back to people, which is something the city is unfortunately taking away from people at a pretty dramatic rate. And then live workspaces are predominantly illegal in Denver. Yeah, you can have a home office, but you can't have a place where you live that is also a place of commerce. It's not just building codes that get in the way. If you have a live workspace, Denver Water requires you to have another water tap. I don't know if anybody's installed another water tap, but they're like thousands and thousands of dollars. So even if they are possible, they're often precluded because of cost. So at the end of the day, what we need to do is collectively come together, continue working as a coalition. I have a housing policy pod that I've assembled that has everybody that's working on all these collectively at a table coming up with what we believe is feasible policy that the city could and should be going after. That's something the city and the state should have been doing up to this point, and they're still not, even though the drum's beating louder and more frequent, even though this crisis is deepening. We need folks that are willing to really get in there and act, and it's not just politicians, it's not just service organizations. We need voters, we need residents to do whatever they can to give a little bit to this topic and have that commitment. And I believe if we do that, that ultimately we can prove as an example, I believe, really for the rest of the country, because a lot of people are looking at Denver, whether it be cannabis or passing things like our gay rights laws. There's a myriad of examples that we've provided for the rest of the country, and I think we should start to do it on this topic. So thank you.